Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Guess we'll get started here. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Vermont Economic Conference. Thank you for joining us today. I am Willie Docto, and I have the honor of moderating the discussion this morning on supporting BIPOC businesses and Vermont professionals of color. The annual Vermont Economic Conference brings content about national and state economic trends to you as part of the Vermont Chamber's mission to build a strong and vibrant economy and to support businesses in our communities. This year's conference is made possible with the support of lead sponsors TD Bank, Comcast, and KPMG. As a reminder for all attendees, both the chat function and a Q&A function are available throughout this webinar. Please note that questions for the presenters should be submitted through the Q&A function, and we will work through as many of them as time allows. If you like, feel free to name the speaker by whom you would like your question answered. I hope you were able to attend yesterday's sessions. They were certainly presented by fantastic experts who were a goldmine. The sessions were packed full of information. If you went back to work yesterday inspired by even one or two nuggets of ideas, then I hope today's sessions can add to that inspiration. While yesterday focused on a more national perspective, today we hope to bring the DEI focus to our home state. A little about me. I am an immigrant from the Philippines, having moved as a child to Queens, New York in the late 1960s. You might say I've always been an immigrant. I was an immigrant to Oklahoma, where my family eventually settled and where I graduated high school. Then I was an immigrant to Washington, D.C., where I went to college. And then I became an immigrant to Vermont. Vermont can be a conducive environment for entrepreneurs, especially when circumstances force you to be creative about making a living in a rural state. I was forced to assess my skills, interests, and figure out a way to build on them and to make a living here. When I made Vermont home in 1996, I simultaneously started two businesses: Docto Association Management, providing services to trade and professional associations, and the Moose Meadow Lodge and Treehouse, a bed and breakfast that I co-own with my husband, Greg Trulson, here in Duxbury. Since I was not busy last year because of the pandemic, I came up with a pandemic project. I started a specialty food business with my family called Willflower, using gluten-free recipes I developed for pancakes and tempura. I also serve on the Travel and Recreation Council, which advises the Vermont Department of Tourism and Marketing, to which I was appointed by former Governor Peter Shumlin and reappointed by Governor Phil Scott. As a member of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors and as the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, we are committed to putting a DEI lens on our work at the Chamber. And it is with that focus, Betsy Bishop and her team have added great content to this year's economic conference. We are continuing to explore how we can bring the resources and assets of the Vermont Chamber to these issues within the scope of economic vitality. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to give a shout out briefly to my fellow members of the DEI task force, along with Vermont Chamber President Betsy Bishop. They are Andrea Gagne Murphy of 14th Star Brewery, Mike Casella of Casella Waste Management, Renee Alves of Vermont Artisan Coffee and Tea, and our board chair, Peter McDougall of Paul Franken Collins. It's truly an honor to work with such a creative and brilliant group of business people. We are joined this morning by an equally impressive panel of Vermont BIPOC professionals who will share their perspectives on how to support BIPOC businesses and organizations, explore ways to view migration into Vermont. Our first has the distinction of having a most melodic name. Tinotenda Charles Rutanhira is the co-founder and board chair of the Vermont Professionals of Color Network. Tino works at dealer.com and sits on the board of the Lake Champlain Regional Chamber of Commerce, as well as the board of the Janice S. Munt Family Room. Secondly, many of you probably already know her, or at least her 3 world-class restaurants, Leslie McCrorey Wells is the co-owner of Burlington's Pizzeria Verità, Trattoria Delia, and Sotto Enoteca. She is a member of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce and the Vermont Independent Restaurant Leadership Council. Finally, we welcome one of our more recent additions to Vermont. Gary Scott is the Vice President of Hospital Services at the University of Vermont Medical Center. He recently moved here from Dallas, where he worked in the utility industry for 22 years before transitioning into healthcare in 2013. Each speaker will have 10 minutes, then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you all for being here today. Okay, so let's start with Tino. Tino, it's great to see you. Welcome. When I first moved to Vermont 25 years ago, I wished that an organization like yours existed. Can you please start us off with a discussion about the Vermont Professionals of Color Network and how individuals and businesses can support that work?
Absolutely, and thank you everybody for this opportunity to speak and present. I hope everybody can see my screen. And so my name is, as Willie said, Tinotenda Charles Rutanhira. I am originally from Zimbabwe, and I am the co-founder and board chair of the Vermont Professionals of Color Network. So the Vermont Professionals of Color Network exists to build opportunities to improve the experience and representation and success of BIPOC professionals and businesses in the state of Vermont. We were founded in January of 2019, and the Vermont Professionals of Color Network was formed as an organization built for BIPOC and by BIPOC. Our organization and foundation is built on advancing networking and career development and business opportunities for our members. Our organization is supported by 3 pillars. The first pillar is promoting BIPOC professional development. Our goal there is to drive a new era of professional mobility for professionals in Vermont. The second pillar is supporting BIPOC entrepreneurship. Our goal there is to empower BIPOC organizations, businesses, and entrepreneurs with the resources, community, and talent needed to stimulate and sustain economic and social growth. And then the third pillar that we support is empowering BIPOC youth. Our goal there is to build capacity for youth of color, ages 16 to 22, to access early career experiential opportunities, mentorship opportunities, and critical life-changing moments to ensure that every young person of color can reach their full potential. Our advocacy and public policy encompasses a wide range of activities that influence decision makers, like policymakers, legislators, corporate executives, etc., in order to advance the cause of BIPOC professionals, businesses, and young people. So that is what our organization does. And we believe that prosperity starts with opportunities to climb the economic ladder. So you might be thinking to yourselves, how can we support BIPOC organizations and professionals? The answer is quite easy. And there's some really low-hanging fruit that you can pick from. So the first thing that I have here is we have how to support BIPOC organizations. First of all, we start with visibility. So we want to make sure that as an organization, we have the opportunity to create visibility into BIPOC organizations, allow people and folks of color to be seen in their organizations. A lot of times we have businesses that are not being supported, and we find that, sorry, has my screen is frozen.
Sorry, it looks like we're having a little, hello? A little technical difficulty here. Hi, sorry about that. We'll try to get Tino back here as soon as possible. All right, I think we'll just we'll try to get Tino back, and we'll go ahead with Leslie. Leslie, you as a Black woman who owns businesses in Vermont have certainly had a interesting journey. Please talk about that. Talk about yourself, your successes, your challenges, and any insights you might have for other people of color who want to start businesses.
Great. Thank you, Willie. And thanks to the Chamber for this opportunity to talk about a subject which is not only near and dear, but is also critically important to the survival and thrival of so many BIPOC business operators and their families. The health of all of our businesses makes for a much stronger community, and we certainly feel that in our hospitality, that it's important for all of us to be successful, and we don't want any of our restaurants to close. So COVID has been very difficult, and more specifically, the intentional support of Black and Brown entrepreneurs, to me, is a form of justice in which individuals can play a role in leveling the playing field for historically and even currently marginalized community members. And this will help Vermonters attract and retain BIPOC, and also makes for good business sense, just generally speaking. So, you know, we all know that BIPOC business owners have faced inequality, discrimination, systemic, individual, and institutional racism in this country since its inception. And this climate continues, hostile climate to some extent continues today. I mean, racism is alive and well and deeply entrenched in all of our institutions. And it will take much more than a statement of support to eradicate it. And so I think our efforts have to be very intentional and strategic in order to bring about the kind of sustained change that I think we all would like to see happen. And it has really been well documented, especially during this time of COVID. It's been very well documented that BIPOC business owners are disproportionately less likely than their white counterparts to get approved for a bank loan, to receive federal aid, to benefit from intergenerational wealth, and to have long-standing relationships with banks and bankers, communities, and our Black communities is also something that, it doesn't, that is disproportionately less than white other business owners. And even having access to mentors and seeing ourselves as business owners is something that is really important to stress. So COVID sort of exacerbated these racial disparities, and certainly at Trattoria, Delia, and Pizzeria Verità, we were hit very hard by the pandemic, just like everyone in the hospitality business was, and we continue to be. We're not out of the woods, but we're lucky. I applied for every pot of money available, and fortunately, being in Vermont where there was support for businesses, we received almost all of it. Fund has been to lessen our debt burden, and it allowed us to purchase things that were needed to keep our customers and our staff safe, including masks and patio furniture, so we could have more outside seating. And it really allowed us to catch our breath and be able to be not as concerned day to day whether we were going to make it. And that money actually basically made up for what we had lost in 2020. So the constant threat of new variants and inconsistent business. We've had to open and close so many times that it's been very disruptive, and supplies are more expensive. So the industry has been, I feel very lucky that we were able to receive that funding. And but I'm very concerned that because BIPOC businesses are so disproportionately affected, that we don't really have a handle on how all businesses, 1,400 restaurants in Vermont, we're not really sure how all restaurants are doing. A third of the applicants did not even receive the grant. And so, this is one thing that we're working on in the Vermont Independent Restaurant Group, to not only to make sure that this restaurant revitalization fund gets refilled, but that we make sure that our Black businesses and our BIPOC businesses are, well connected, and that we can remove some of these barriers for folks. And in order to remove those barriers, again, support has to be very meaningful and long lasting. For example, I don't know how many people are aware of Aurora James. She started this 15% pledge. And the idea of the program was that retail corporations would reserve 15% of shelf space to Black-owned businesses. And it's very inspiring to see how many people are coming up with very creative ideas to make this sustained change, and to level the playing field. And the creativity of like Aurora James and many other young aspiring entrepreneurs is very inspiring. And there are a few Black networking and support organizations like Tino's and that are crucial in not only providing these opportunities for communities to band together, but perhaps even just as importantly and more importantly, they're helping our BIPOC communities from within to support, to heal, and to build sustained networks. So, I applaud the work, Tino, that you were doing, and the relief community, and many organizations that are coming together to make this possible. And so I would encourage people to seek out Black-owned businesses, have conversations with restaurateurs that find out how they're doing, find out if they are connected and have been able to get the funds that they need, and just have those conversations. It goes a long way. And I think in order for us to really make the change that we need and want in our community, that's a really good, and as Tino started to talk about, low-hanging fruit. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. And I'm glad you brought up Aurora James, because she is a fashion designer who created that 15% pledge. And major companies have already signed on to the commitment of putting 15% of their products on their shelves from BIPOC-owned businesses, and including Sephora, Macy's, Bloomingdale's, Yelp, Crate and Barrel, Gap, Old Navy, Banana Republic, and it grows from there. So maybe that's something that we in Vermont can think about doing, somehow incorporating. We have a lot of BIPOC-owned businesses here who produce things. Maybe we get retailers to buy into the idea that we need to make those businesses more visible and buy and sell their products. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I also like your comments about being intentional in this work, because that is the important thing. We need to constantly look at everything with a DEI lens and look for ways to serve the community and to, at the same time, make our businesses more successful. So great. Well, thank you. And we'll get back to you again. And we're trying to loop back, give time to Tino to get back on his computer. So we're going to continue with Gary Scott. And Gary is a recent transplant immigrant to Vermont. And as a fellow immigrant to Vermont, I hope that you have been dealing with the winters okay. I just have 2 words of advice for you: snow tires.
All right.
Okay. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Willie. I appreciate it, sir. So I appreciate the advice, but coming from Texas, you have to drive a 4x4 truck down there to be considered, a Texan. So all-weather tires and 4x4 four-wheeler truck. I've been able to manage the winters quite well up here. So I'm going into my second winter here, and things are much better than the first. I'll share my transition story. When I got here last November of 2020, the first day I got here, the very next day it snowed, and the snow did not leave Vermont until the following April. So the snow was here for a very long time. Very difficult transition to come to a new state in the wintertime and not have any community. So things changed a little bit later on, but initially when you get here, I would recommend that if you're transitioning, you have to create community when you first get here as soon as you can. So you're looking for a personal community as well as professional community. And from a personal standpoint, you get here in November, you're Thanksgiving alone, you don't know anyone. You have to start trying to, as Vermonters, we have to be aware that when folks are transitioning here, that community is important. So it would have been nice for me to be able to come here and have a church identified or people that I could have spent Thanksgiving with. Even though you don't know each other, it would have been nice to, if we were doing the pandemic as well. But if we were not in the pandemic, it would have been nice to transition and maybe have somewhere to spend Thanksgiving, to have a church to connect with, to have some after work activities, or a guy like myself who doesn't ski or who is new to winter sports. It would have been nice to have a transition where I could have met folks like me that looked like me, had the same interests as I have, and spent some after work activities. When you're working, when you're transitioning here and you're working and you're leaving work and you're going to a hotel room, your mental health can suffer a little bit. So spending 6-7 months in a hotel, initially I thought that things were not going to work out here for me. It wasn't as though I wasn't looking. It was just that the opportunity to find housing here was very difficult. And I'll talk about that later, the housing challenges later. But the first point, as I said, I wanted to make was connecting with community, personal community, and then a professional community. So I think I didn't connect with a group of professionals until March of 2021. That's when I was introduced to the Vermont Professionals of Color. And at that time, they were performing, they had a BIPOC vaccine clinic that I volunteered at and got to meet a group of people, a group of professionals. And at that point in time, I was able to start connecting with professionals and also build some strong personal relationships as well. So not only did I, going through the Vermont Professionals of Color, not only did I have a chance to meet other professionals that could help with my transition, I also was able to start building some personal relationships as well, which I desperately needed. So, excuse me, I'm sorry, which I definitely desperately needed. So having the Vermont Professionals of Color be a community for me and introduce me to other Black and brown folks was instrumental, I think, in my transition here. I was just about close to thinking, oh, maybe I made the wrong decision when by coming here. But at the right time, I was able to meet people that looked like me and provided a community for me. I think it's very important that if you don't come here and seek community immediately, I think your transition here may be short-lived. And I think you want to bring diverse folks into Vermont so we can have a sustained long-term labor force here. Second, I'll just say something about what Leslie mentioned the word, you have to be intentional. And I think that goes both ways. As a person immigrating here to Vermont, I had to be intentional. I had to seek out organizations and friends and people to provide a community for me. So I'll leave that part there, and I'll go to my next point. My next point is housing. So transitioning here for me was a bit of a shock in terms of the housing. First of all, the lack of housing. I didn't stay in a hotel for 7 months because I wanted to be in a hotel for 7 months. I absolutely could not find housing. And transitioning here as a vice president, I felt like my buying potential was pretty good. It was average, it was okay. But what I found when I got here was that even transitioning here as a vice president, the housing, the affordability was just, it was a shock, I'll say that. So I think we as a state, we have to do something about affordable housing. And I don't just mean affordable housing for entry-level employees. I mean affordable housing for all. As Leslie mentioned, most Black and brown folks are not going to come here with wealth and inherited wealth and generational wealth. We're going to come here looking for opportunities to take care of our families. And if you're not financially able to come here and afford home and housing, then the chance of people staying here will also be limited. So two issues when it came to housing: just the lack of housing and the lack of affordable housing. It almost made me feel like when I got here that Vermont talked a really great talk around inclusivity and being allies to the Black and brown community, but it almost felt like the housing was a way to really keep folks out. Everybody can't come here and buy houses on the lake or afford $500,000-$600,000 houses. And it just felt like, we talked a great game, but when it came to affordability, if you can't afford to stay here, then you probably won't stay here. So I feel like there's something that we need to address as a state. It's not just low income housing, but affordable housing in general. Then I'll say the finally for me, transitioning here, just having basic needs. And what I'll say about that is trying to figure out, what are you going to get your car maintained? Where do you go get your snow tires put on? Where do you go to get to a barber to find a shave? Or, where do you go shopping for clothes? Where do you go get the basic needs done or met as a Black or brown person? And so not having anyone when you come here, I think the first thing you have to do is you have to find that community. You have to understand the housing situation when you move here, or you will be shocked. And I think you have to, it will be very nice if you could walk in here, connect with a group of people that could help you understand what the basic needs are, or help you find and meet your basic needs. So that's my transition story, Willie, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. You bring up a lot of excellent points. Housing is definitely an issue that's on the front of mind of every business here, as well as the legislature and the governor. There's no easy answers. As a bed and breakfast owner, over the years, I have witnessed tourists, guests who have come here, have fallen in love, and eventually bought property or moved here. They've made it work somehow. But that was, in the past. I still have guests who are interested in moving here. I have one particular couple from Chicago who is a lawyer, and his wife is a marketing executive. They too are in a great position to afford a house here, but there's just nothing available. And imagine people who are starting out and wanting to move here and to find something. I mean, we're lucky we bought 25 years ago. We could not afford to move here now. So, nobody has an easy answer, and the answers will take time too. So it's really a terrible situation that we're in. We're trying to attract people here, but they have no place to live.
Yeah, well, I'll say this, if you want Vermont to be a state that matters in the future, we've got to fix the housing issue. You won't be able to attract people to keep them here and fulfill our economic needs in the economy if people can't afford housing. People can't afford to stay here and live here. The salaries are not enough to overcome the challenges associated with housing.
Well, besides housing, you raised a couple of other issues, and we have time to discuss this now. But are there opportunities for employers or for the Chamber of Commerce to come up with a way to help people transition into Vermont, like you were saying, finding people of similar interests or similar backgrounds, having a social life, and that all affects, like you said, your mental health and your sense of belonging. That's so important. The sense of belonging to a community is what keeps people here. So perhaps, any ideas on maybe how employers like the University of Vermont Medical Center could help people like you transition?
Yeah, I think there are many ways that many ideas out there. The one idea that I propose to some folks that I work with is, and it's hard to do. It's not easy, but as an organization, maybe we should partner with a developer to invest in land and housing for our employees. So when our employees move here, we don't lose good qualified candidates because they have nowhere to stay. So as the VP that's over planning, design, and construction, one of the things that we will be implementing into our future master plan is we'll be presenting the idea of meeting with different developers, and buying land close to the university, to the medical center, and developing potentially some housing, affordable housing. And it'll be, in my opinion, it should be mixed use housing. It shouldn't be low income or high income or middle. It should be mixed use housing, so anybody can choose to stay there and have a nice place to stay and take care of their families.
Okay, great. And we'll get back to you again. We're going to try to, thank you very much, Gary. We're going to try to get Tino back. Tino, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Very good.
My sincere apologies, everybody, for the technical challenges. I think it's one of those things that we've now figured we just got to take in your stride as we do kind of this online virtual presentation stuff. So just to kind of pick up from where we left off, I had been talking about who we are as an organization and about our pillars and how we are organized, and talking about supporting BIPOC professional development, supporting BIPOC entrepreneurship, and empowering youth, as well as our advocacy piece, which is to influence decision makers and policymakers, legislators, corporate executives, etc. So when I think we kind of left off, I was asking the question, how would you support BIPOC businesses, for example? So you can support BIPOC businesses. The first thing you could do is start with visibility. The best way to support BIPOC businesses is to financially support these businesses and organizations by buying their products. On our website, vtpoc.net, we have the state's first and most dynamic BIPOC business directory. We currently have over 400 BIPOC-owned businesses that are listed on our website. So you can make it a point to go to look at those websites when you want to go out for dinner, or you want to get your plumbing done, or your appliances down, or maybe perhaps you're looking for an attorney or a tax accountant, whatever. Look it up on our BIPOC website and look to see maybe there's somebody who is BIPOC that you can support. And then as well, you can, if you like their work, you can also make it a point to feature them. It could be in your local or regional publications, sharing a social media post, or even having, if you have a podcast or a blog, feature them on that. You can also ask what they need. A simple yet effective way to support BIPOC-owned businesses and organizations is simply to ask. Once you've identified a BIPOC-owned business in your community that you'd like to help, go ahead and reach out to them, to the owners, and ask how you can better support them. Because that's all it's about. And once you start talking to them, build a relationship. As BIPOC people and BIPOC business owners like myself, I also own my own business. We don't want your support just because we are Black and brown. We want your support because you also believe in us and you believe in our mission and our vision and our values. Also, share our businesses within your social circles. It's not rocket science, and it is actually free. A simple yet impactful action is to patronize BIPOC-owned businesses and share the businesses on with your social circles. The more people who are aware of the opportunity to buy from a BIPOC-owned business, the better. Also, you can also write reviews on Yelp and Google to also allow those BIPOC businesses to get better visibility, and also sharing those positive interactions you've had with them. The greatest way to support BIPOC-owned businesses and organizations is financially. So financial stability is a true key economic empowerment factor. When a BIPOC-owned business thrives, it leads to more jobs and to a stronger workforce, not only for economically distressed areas, but also in affluent areas as well. And an equitable business sector is a strong business sector, and a prosperous BIPOC community is a good thing for all of Vermont. We also want to ask you to provide equal access to funding. We want to go beyond BIPOC-owned businesses being mom and pop shops and sole proprietorships. We want them to become large employers and to win government contracts and win private sector contracts, so that BIPOC-owned businesses can then become the next SD Irelands, the next Dealer.coms, the next seventh generations of the state. One sure way to do this is by getting them access to private and public sector contracts, because guaranteed revenue allows businesses to go from being a one-person shop to being a two-person, five-person, 10-person organization, and to become a large player in the Vermont economy. And then a close second behind spending your actual money with BIPOC-owned businesses and organizations is spending your time and your resources. If you have expertise, like technical expertise or technical skills, learned experiences, or a network that can benefit BIPOC business owners, offer them as a value add to them. With access to a diverse range of resources, networks, and capitals, and potential partners and clientele, BIPOC entrepreneurs can build better businesses and also allow them the opportunity to pivot in the event that opportunities come along or new innovative ways of doing things are brought to their attention, because they'll have a stronger support system alongside them each step of the way. So the last kind of section is supporting BIPOC entrepreneurs. So we've talked about supporting BIPOC businesses, now supporting BIPOC entrepreneurs. Now we talk about supporting BIPOC professionals. The Vermont Professionals of Color Network is an apolitical organization, but we do believe that racism is deeply ingrained in our society, and as a result, it's deeply ingrained in our workplaces too. So we believe that systems that are failing communities of color are failing all of us alike, Black, brown, and white. So as a predominantly white community, you cannot advocate for equity and inclusion when the median net worth of a Black family is $30,000 and that of a white family is $190,000. Something has to change. Additionally, creating diversity in your workforce isn't just a good social decision, it's good business. We all know that diverse companies outperform their counterparts in almost every single metric, from financial performance, creativity, so employee satisfaction, retention, etc. So here's how you can help support BIPOC professionals. Firstly, you can diversify your hiring and promotion tactics, and to find new avenues of reaching a greater variety of prospective employees. I'm going to shamelessly plug the jobs board on the VTPOC website. We have built a jobs board there as a result of companies asking us, like, hey, we're looking to diversify our workforce. Can you try and connect us with people that are looking for jobs? So we built a jobs board. Go and advertise on that jobs board, because you will find a concentrated a niche of BIPOC professionals looking for good paying jobs with good career prospects. You can advertise on LinkedIn or Career Builder, but there's no guarantee that those eyeballs that you're targeting on those sites are going to be BIPOC and are going to be people right here in Vermont. Also, purposefully look to recruit from HBCUs and not just BIPOC people from elite institutions. Institutions that are less prestigious still can have a lot of great talent that you can find. Create a new recruiting strategy. So white professionals are relocating to Vermont from the Boston suburbs and metro cities like New York and Philly. They come here in search of what Vermont has to offer: high quality of life, access to nature, the wide open spaces. You know, some who come here to Chittenden County are attracted to the city of Burlington, which punches way above its weight for a city of its size. One has to think like, why aren't young BIPOC couples relocating for the same reasons? Do BIPOC couples not want a safe place to raise their kids? Do they not want great schools or access to the mountains or the lake and to nature, etc.? We just haven't made that pitch to that opportunity for BIPOC people to know about all the cool things that people like myself have decided to stay in Vermont and call Vermont home. Now is the time to conduct diversity audits to learn about where racial unfairness might hide within your organization. Much racism is structural and institutional and has been around for decades. So you cannot expect that it's going to go away because of one meeting or one initiative that you've implemented. So expect this to be an ongoing process. By using HR data, sort your workers based on job types, job levels, etc. within your company, and then try and uncover clues of discrimination and inequity in your organization. Look at promotions and pay and turnover, etc. Also, invest in board membership. We know that there's a clear relationship between diversity of thought and return on equity on other key business performance measurements. So why stop your DEI initiatives with your employees? These initiatives should move beyond employees into the boardroom. And on the flip side, board membership for BIPOC professionals gives them insight into how businesses are run, how decisions are made, and how leaders lead. It's an invaluable experience for us to be in the engine room of industry and commerce. And then the last thing here I'll say is that promote BIPOC employees. So many times I look around me in a meeting or at a conference and I'm the only person of color in the room. I look at the leadership hierarchy within the organization where I work, and there's only one non-white leader at director level or above. We need to see more people like Gary Scott or people like Pramila Peters at Data Innovations or Kyle Dodson at the Greater YMCA in senior management positions. Because how do I, as a Black man, aspire to be in a leadership position in an organization if there's no one that I can look up to or try to emulate? And as a Black board chair of a newly formed organization, who do I reach out to find advice and support and mentorship if there aren't any people of color in those positions that can help me through some of the obstacles and challenges that I will face as a board chair? So thank you for your time. And again, my apologies for the snafu with the technology. I ask you to please go ahead and share the Vermont Professionals of Color Network websites to your employees and your colleagues. You can join as a non-BIPOC person. It's just that there are some privileges that are reserved specifically for BIPOC members as well.
Great. Thank you, Tino. Thank you so much, Tino. You're always packed with information and ideas that are just amazing. You know, the issue of not just recruiting BIPOC employees, but actually promoting them is an issue all across the country. You know, BIPOC employees are elevated to a supervisory level and then to a management level. But at some point, for whatever reason, they start falling off. So they never quite reach the C-suite, right? So I think right now there are only 4 BIPOC CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. That's incredulous. I'm incredulous, you know? So, you know, what ways can employers ensure that BIPOC management people are supported, and they may have different needs, whether it's their home situation or their historical family situation. So I think there's lots of opportunities there, and great ideas that you have. So
Thank you.
I think we will bring in everybody else now and ask some questions. There was a question on the Q&A from Maricela Amen. This one is directed to Leslie. Are there any specific resources BIPOC business owners have expressed the need for when applying to state and federal grants for aid? I know the processes for applications have been challenging, even to the most savvy and experienced business owner.
So I don't have the answer to that question. Again, we need to find a way to get to as many people as we can. For example, when we first were applying for the restaurant revitalization fund, people came out of the woodwork to let me know about it. So I had a lawyer call me that I had used at one point, call me from Dinzy and just say, I just wanted to let you know that this is happening. I'm like, yeah. Just make sure your application is ready to go. I'm like, yeah, I got it. And then I'd have one of our, several of our distributors were calling me. Leslie, just want to let you know, get your application in right away. Because it was because the Small Business Administration had actually put a priority for 2 weeks on BIPOC, marginalized communities, women, veteran-owned businesses. And so that was, it was really important to get that in. So there was a real scramble. People were calling, but I feel like I'm pretty connected. I worry about restaurants that are not necessarily connected. So that's why, getting that information, something that we're working on at the chamber and with the Vermont Independent Restaurant, getting that information, being able to call people, we email people. We're constantly just trying to get everyone connected as best we can. It's funny, the whole thing that happened with the RRF was that a couple of lawsuits started in Texas, I believe, and shut the whole thing down. And so many people who even had already in the queue, their funds were taken filled. So many restaurants out there are probably hanging on by their fingertips for this to move through. So we need a better way of connecting people in our industry. So who are busy and trying to keep trying to keep things going, so we can really, we can really help each other. Is my video? Am I unstable? My voice? Okay.
Well,
I hope I answered the question a little bit. I don't really have the answer, unfortunately,
Yeah.
but it's an important question, and it's important for us to connect as Vermonters to all of our BIPOC restaurants.
Right. It is. So I have something to add to that on a personal level. As an owner of a bed and breakfast, the lodging and hospitality industry was hit very hard the last couple of years. There was a program that was directly targeted to BIPOC business owners or BIPOC owned businesses, but the cutoff was 51% ownership. Now, with a partnership of two, where one is BIPOC and the other one is not, we didn't qualify. So
we didn't either. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. You're in the same situation. So there was no consideration for two-person partnerships, right? So we missed out on that grant. I mean, we were able to get some other assistance, and thank goodness for the pandemic unemployment assistance, because that got us through the year. But as far as, that helped us personally, but as far as helping our business directly, that grant was not accessible to us. So anybody else have any comments they'd like to add? So one issue we have is that most of the BIPOC community in Vermont is concentrated in Chittenden County. That's where most of us are visible and work, but there are still others outside of Chittenden County in more rural areas. What can we do to help those people, to reach out to them? I don't know, Tino, if your organization has many members outside of Chittenden County and what your goals are in reaching out to those people.
Yeah, I mean, we are the Vermont Professionals of Color Network and not the Chittenden County Professionals of Color Network. So we absolutely are trying to reach out to our members and to BIPOC the communities outside of Chittenden County. Like you said, there is a concentration in this county, but even if we can reach people outside of Chittenden County, we want to make sure that they don't feel isolated. A lot of the events that we're doing are now virtual, and not just as a result of COVID, but we have made some conscious decisions to try and make sure that we do try as often as possible to have virtual events. Now, sometimes it does make sense to meet in person, but we're doing as much as we can virtually. We have done, for example, a financial literacy event that we recently did virtually that allowed members from all around the state to just sign in and participate. We also met with some members of the legislature, and that was virtual. That allowed members from everywhere to just kind of dial in and speak about the issues that are important to them. So yeah, I guess I would like to encourage, if anybody is listening out there and feels like, I'm all alone, we're here to support, and we're here to provide access and community to those people so that they do not feel isolated.
Great. Al Wakefield, who was one of our speakers yesterday, posted something on the chat that I just wanted to point out. The Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity sponsors welcoming gatherings for BIPOC newcomers. Curtis Reed is the executive director of this organization, and it's based in Brattleboro. So Curtis has done a lot of great things for the state, and he's based down south. So, there are a lot of BIPOC related organizations in this state, and if you look even just a little bit, you'll find them. One of them is the NAACP chapters here in Vermont, which got a big grant from Northfield Savings Bank to support their work. And I believe Vermont Professionals of Color Network got a grant to help you guys. So Tino, with in your presentation, one of the suggestions you had was to invest in that community and partner with all these organizations. So sponsoring events is one way to do it. Sponsoring an organization and getting them started is another way to do it. There are people out there doing this work. They just need some more help. There's the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, the Vermont Office of Racial Equity, which is led by Susanna Davis. We all know her. So, there's lots of really great work happening in Vermont. The Vermont Chamber of Commerce, in the last couple of years has spent a lot of time focusing on DEI. We can't fix all social justice issues, but what we can is what's in our wheelhouse, which is economic vitality. That's what we're going to focus on. That's how we're going to become more successful. We're going to try to fix that issue that we can that we have access to. We can't fix everything, but we're going to try to fix the things from the business end and the economic end. So, any other thoughts from anybody? Any parting words or?
You know, I would just like to, I'd like to just add, you know, to follow up on what Tino had said about how important supporting Black businesses are, but how all businesses are more successful, or how our communities are more economically successful if we are all successful. And I think it can't be understated just how, you know, that the way I want to put this is economically, it's in everyone's best interest for us to have a diverse and multicultural and multi-ethnic community that brings all kinds of wonderful things to the community, and being able to support that, to be able to retain people, to be, for example, I know there was something talked about in the chat about that Meg had suggested, that can't believe that Gary came here without having some, you know, something in place. I mean, UVM is a big, we used to have, when my father came to UVM in the 60s, you know, it's like they gave him a house to live in at 40th and Allen, you know, so just to not have that in place is a huge waste of money, and it's a waste of time if people are not connected and therefore leave. We have a lot of people leaving UVM, and our people, and so it's really critical for people to understand the economic, you know, issues there, and it's hard to believe that wasn't connected.
Great.
And the toll on Gary, you know, that's the other piece of the human toll on it as well.
Right, right. So we have just a few more questions to go through. We have a little more time. So let me go through this. Gary's example, this is from Teresa Murray Klassen. Gary's example of partnering with a developer to work on employee housing is a good one. Could each speaker share ideas you have or have heard of regarding increasing affordable housing?
Well, I think I've shared the idea that I have. I think being a new Vermonter, only been here a little bit over a year, thinking about it from a perspective of the medical center and how, as an employer, what we can do. That's the one thing that I've thought of. But what I would also add in there, what I'm thinking of from a UVMC medical center perspective, is also affordable childcare. So it's housing and it's affordable childcare as well. So although I may not have those childcare issues, a lot of folks who work in the departments that I'm over currently have a hard time balancing life, because the housing is not affordable, nor is childcare. So I don't have any other ideas to share about the department developers, so I'll leave that to my colleagues to see if they have anything to share.
Yeah, I can jump in. I do think that one area that we need to discuss as an entire state is Act 250. I believe the whole act needs to be reevaluated or rewritten. While it was initially written for good, I think it's become a giant yoke on the collective necks of Vermonters, and disproportionately disadvantages those that don't have the capacity or the resources or the finances to navigate around it. And that population is mainly people of color. You know, the housing discussion falls squarely in with the Act 250 discussion. And I think Act 250 doesn't need to be an either or situation. There's room for compromise. And unfortunately though, I think Act 250 has become, I don't know, it's a bad example, but I'm gonna go with it anyway. It's become like guns and abortion. You know, you're either on one side of it or the other, and there's no in between, and it's become a divisive issue, and it's going to be to the detriment of the state. And I think the legislators need to come up with a way of rewriting that act so that it allows it works the way it was supposed to be written, not back in the 1950s or 60s, whenever it was written, but works for today in 2021, 2022.
Yeah, definitely regulation, building regulations, development regulations have influenced or affected affordability in this state. But, we love living in paradise, but what is the price of living in paradise? And I think we're getting the answer. When are we going to be more practical about things and more creative as well?
Right.
So,
yeah, and that's why for me, I feel like it doesn't have to be an either or. There is room for compromise, and we shouldn't get to the point where it becomes you either for it or against it, and there's no middle ground. And that's where I think the challenge lies right now, is we're just failing to kind of meet somewhere in the middle.
yeah. And Gary brought up, childcare. I think maybe I might suggest to Betsy that next year we have a whole session on transitioning into Vermont and addressing childcare and housing affordability and just the day-to-day stuff, like you said, Gary, of how to find where to get your snow tires. So, I think we're in this discussion, we're coming up with some interesting ideas. So, one thing I can add to the housing issue as an innkeeper, the lodging industry here, the licensed lodging industry, and I say that because a lot of us who are licensed, all of us, we have to go through an inspection process to get our restaurant license or to get our lodging license. Vacation rentals don't have to do that. A lot of investors are coming into the state and buying up inventory of houses and then renting them out through websites. Now, full disclosure, my bed and breakfast we list ourselves on those websites because you can't ignore them. They're the air you have to breathe or you're going to die. So, but there are, how do we deal with that? So, we've been trying to push for legislation that will make that more level playing field. And we continue to work with the governor's office and try to fix those issues. But I just want to say that one of the problems we have for finding affordable housing is because housing is being scooped up by investors who may not even live in the state.
Right.
So it's one thing to own a house here and you have an extra room that you want to rent out to somebody and make a little money. That's great. It allows you to live here. But if you're buying places and you don't even live here just to invest, that really, I think, hurts us in the long run. So let me go through some more questions that are popping in right now. We have only about 5 minutes or 9 minutes left. So Jen Daniel says, I wanted to share the Racial Equity Alliance of Lamoille, or REAL, has been focusing on supporting local businesses, both in educating white-owned businesses and supporting BIPOC-owned businesses. Weaving these communities is vital, particularly in these rural areas. There are many barriers to entry for lack of education and awareness in these small town governments and economic development committees. Thank you, Tino, and I am glad to be able to take advantage and share out what I am hearing today. So more of a comment than a question, really. And by the way, REAL is a great organization. Who would think that up there in the Stowe, Hyde Park, Morrisville area, that there would be such an organization. And here in Waterbury, in my community, we have the, what are they called? The Waterbury Anti-Racism Coalition. So, all these little towns are coming up with ways to become more visible, which is wonderful. Okay, so a question or a comment, let's see, from William Winstead. I agree with all of the housing thoughts. Has the thought of how the banks work with loans and qualifications come up? I feel that financing is a big issue as well. Going through it myself, trying to find something and being self-employed is very difficult with getting a mortgage. Yeah, great point, William. Any thoughts on that? I mean, Gary, you're, like you said, you're in a good position to buy a home, except that there's nothing to buy. So, what's your experience been with finding a mortgage?
Well, typically I hadn't had an issue finding a mortgage, but in Vermont, I just don't feel like I can afford a mortgage here. The houses are, even though I come in at an executive level, what you get here compared to what you get in Texas, I don't want to pay that, and I don't want a mortgage here, and so I'm content to rent for the next 9 years until I retire. But for most folks, that may not be an option. But for me, the banking experience, I haven't had to go through that in Vermont, but everywhere else I've been, the banking experience is a challenge. I recently went through a refi that lasted almost a year. And I'm assets in the bank, income coming in, and the refi lasted almost an entire year. And so I was just shocked at their process. I couldn't imagine one of my friends going through that who's not a person of color. I can remember him telling me that when he went to get a loan for a business, he didn't even have anything. He just went, and the people knew his father, the folks at the bank knew his father, and he was able to buy 2 dump trucks and start a business without much paperwork. And this is recently, with all the 2008 stuff that happened, he was still able to go in, get a loan without much, because his family had a relationship with the bank. I don't have a personal banker. I don't have a family banker that I can go to and that just knows me or knows my father. So I think that the interactions are different. They're definitely different, and they're more challenging for folks of color. Even when it comes to selling your home, the price you get versus a white counterpart, a non-minority counterpart, is just different.
The unfortunate thing about that, Gary, we want you to have a mortgage. And so, because we want to keep you here, and that should be the goal, to make sure that you're taken care of, But that's the piece that's unfortunate, because if we want to build this community and we want to, attract BIPOC folks to come here, we have to make sure that it's a place that they can make home. So it's critical.
And from the Vermont Professionals of Color Network perspective, we actually, I said just earlier, had a virtual financial literacy seminar where we had subject matter experts relating to student loans. We had somebody from VSAC, personal loans. We had somebody from a bank, personal taxes. We had a gentleman who runs a tax company, I guess, and investments. And we had somebody who works for Edward Jones. All of those participants, or at least the presenters, were BIPOC. And so we were able to speak to our BIPOC audience about financial literacy from a BIPOC perspective and money management, etc. We actually have decided that we want to do an even deeper dive into the topic of financial literacy, because it's important. It's part of our vision, really, because it's one thing to, if you look at our mission statement, to advance the BIPOC, the prosperity of BIPOC professional Vermonters in Vermont. However, it's another thing, and equally as important, if not more important, to ensure that we educate our people on what to do once they reach that level of prosperity, and then how to then build generational wealth. Because when we look at our white counterparts, they're getting $100,000 inheritance from their grandfathers, $1 million, and whereas we as BIPOC people are starting from zero. And so when I'm now looking to buy a house, it's coming out of my own personal savings and stuff, when my white counterpart already has an inheritance that is sitting there just waiting. So buying that $500,000 house, yes, it's a pain in the butt, but you know, I can afford it because I've got $1 million sitting there waiting for me. Whereas for myself or somebody like Gary, who maybe could afford it if he was to want to try and like really kind of sink his money in there, that means pretty much maybe everything that he has wrapped up in savings is now going towards that house, and then leaves him what they say, like house poor or something. So we are looking at doing like a series that is a real deep dive into personal finance, insurance, personal taxes, student loans, personal loans, mortgages, wealth and investment management, retirement, wills and estate planning, all of that stuff. Because when we try and advance the prosperity of BIPOC people, we don't want to just end there. We want to then make sure that they have the wherewithal to then invest that, to make that money take care of themselves and do it in a smart way. So that's coming up. If anybody in the audience is a subject matter expert at these, would love to hear from you guys, because we want to make this a really informative series that runs throughout the whole year and is going to be really deep in all of those topics.
Great. I have just time for one more comment or question here, because we have to close. This is on the chat from Abby Willard. What more could we do to ensure access and resources for procuring culturally appropriate foods, direct from farms, retail, etc.? I don't know, maybe Leslie, you have experience in working with farms and farms owned by BIPOC people?
Well, there's some really great organizations that, and I know Abby's familiar with them, that are, I'm part of the Relief Collective, and just the emails that go back and forth in terms of sharing and working together to build the community within our community is really, it's inspiring, because it's a change from, now I've been here for 50 some odd years, or 50 years. It's such a change from when Black folks were here before, and we were just very, it was very fractured, and we were just trying to survive. It feels now that we have a community. And so that community, connecting with, BIPOC communities and making sure that we're supporting each other, I think is really critical. There's a lot of work that's being done all over the place. Many organizations were just talked about in this meeting, really making sure that we have a connection so that we're sharing resources and not all just spinning wheels in different places. And then and to Abby's concern, making sure that we're all part of ensuring that we have food security for everybody. So I think that making those connections would be critical.
Yeah, wonderful. And the one thing about Vermont is the agricultural community is sustained by restaurants like you, who understand the importance of working with them. So thank you. Any other quick thoughts from anybody before we close?
Willie, I like to just share one thing. I think I'd be remiss if I don't say something about opportunities at the medical center. So I'm over hospital services, and what I want folks of color to know is that you don't have to be a doctor or a nurse or a clinician to have a good career at a hospital. I have security jobs, safety jobs, engineering jobs, project manager jobs, housekeeping jobs. I have jobs from all spectrums, and my jobs are safe. As a Black person, I look forward to protecting Black employees and brown employees who may have challenges getting here on time, who may not speak English. We are trying to make strides in accepting folks if they don't speak English, whether you're a refugee from Afghanistan or you're from Africa, wherever. We have safe jobs for people. And this is before the pandemic or the shortage of employee or of people working ever came about. there are safe jobs here. And I look forward to protecting our employees who may have challenges getting to work here or childcare with that. We try to accommodate those people. Even if you can't speak English, we try to put you to work and provide a safe atmosphere for you.
That's fantastic, Gary. I'm so glad you're there, and continue to keep safe. You've got a huge responsibility on your shoulders running that hospital. I bow to you. What a great job. So, all right. Anybody else, really quick, before we close?
I'll just jump in and say we welcome your support at vtpoc.net. Vermont is 600,000 people. We do not need a 20-year vision. We can make change in 5 years. We are big, we are smaller than most big cities in this country. So we don't need something to take until 2045 for us to see effect. What we are proposing is radical transformation, and we hope that everybody joins us in this revolution.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We could talk about this all day. Thank you, everyone, for attending the 2022 Vermont Economic Conference presented by the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, Vermont's leading voice for businesses. Thank you once again to our lead sponsors, TD Bank, Comcast, and KPMG. This annual conference is an essential component to the mission of the Vermont Chamber. We're grateful for such a vibrant community that allows our work and relationships to continue to thrive even in a pandemic. We are going to take a short break before the next session at 10 a.m. on Vermont's growing demographic challenges, featuring Matt Barewicz, Chief Economist for the Vermont Department of Labor, and Renee Bourget-Place, Managing Partner at KPMG. You won't want to miss it. So thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Vermont Economic Conference. I'm delighted to be here in this last session of the Economic Conference. Where did Vermont's workforce go? I'm Renee Bourget-Place, and I'm the managing partner of Vermont's KPMG office. And I've been a longtime supporter of the Vermont Economic Conference, but I'm particularly excited to sponsor this year's conference because it aligns so well with many of KPMG's key priorities, namely increasing our workforce and increasing the diversity and inclusivity of our workforce. For those of you who listened to the last session, I thought Tino Rutanhira made a tremendous comment, which was increasing diversity isn't really about doing good socially, but it's good business. And certainly that aligns with KPMG's views as well. I'd like to make sure that we thank my co-presenting sponsors in TD Bank and Comcast, as well as the other sponsors this year, which are Velco and Derringer, Vermont Gas Systems, Green Mountain Power, and Premier Piper, Eggleston, and Kramer. Without all of these sponsors, this content doesn't happen. A quick note about the Vermont Economic Conference that is really intended to bring this kind of content to Vermont's business communities. It's part of the Vermont Chamber's key mission, and it's been a long-standing staple in Vermont's business community. I am going to introduce our presenter today, Matt Barewicz, who doesn't need much of an introduction because he has been a presenter at this conference for quite some time. But for those that don't know him, Matt Barewicz is the chief economist at the Vermont Department of Labor. He's got more than 14 years of experience, both in the public and private sector as an economist. And he's really going to expand on Vermont's growing demographic problem, presenting the numbers behind Vermont's missing workforce. Before I turn it over to Matt, I just want to make sure that attendees know that we can leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So you have the ability to use the Q&A or the chat function. And when Matt finishes his presentation, I'll filter through those questions and we'll try to get as many in as possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Matt. Nice to see you.
Great, thank you. Appreciate the introduction, Renee. And thank you for the Chamber for putting on this event.
Matt, I think you're muted still.
Really? How about now? Still saying I'm muting? Hello, hello?
I cannot hear you still.
What? That is impossible. I can hear. Okay, so someone said, okay, yeah. So, all right, good. Well, let's start it again. Thank you so much for the Chamber for putting this on. It is not an easy thing to put these things together, so I really appreciate Betsy and her team doing this, and Emma is doing a lot behind the scenes to keep us all organized. But I'm particularly honored to be part of this particular event because of the incredible content that's been delivered over the last couple of days. So I really appreciate all the participants and all the presenters taking time out of their day to share with us their knowledge and extremely valuable information on how to do many, many things, which ultimately all benefit us. And that's what I really look at from an economic benefit standpoint, is just like, this is how Vermont grows, this is how Vermont improves. And there's just been so many takeaways from here, it's impossible to highlight any just one, but a lot of them, I will say, align directly with economic thinking. And particularly, I will highlight Gus's comments, if people saw Gus, who's been a long time participant in this event, talking about immigration, legal immigration into the United States being the biggest economic driver for economic growth in the US over decades. And economic theory bears that out, of course. So I'm going to do a screen share here. We'll go through some presentation in the form of PowerPoint. And then, as Renee said, there's going to be opportunities for discussion, questions. And I've been here long enough to know that no one pulls any punches when it comes to questions. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm well caffeinated, so I should be ready to go. So I am now sharing. And here we are, the Economic Conference. So who I am, I'm with the Vermont Department of Labor, as mentioned. I'm with the Economic and Labor Market Information Division. There's one of those divisions in every state in the nation, plus Guam, Puerto Rico, DC, and the Virgin Islands. These 54 territories form the US data system, and we're all predominantly funded by the US Department of Labor. A bulk of our money comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which pays us to collect, compile, and release economic data consistent with federal methodology. So when we're talking about things like the unemployment rate or how many people work in manufacturing, we're all using the same federal definition and playbook so that the data is comparable across the country and ultimately can be aggregated into the US estimates and numbers. But it's a smaller pot of money from the Employment and Training Administration that makes it possible for me to be here today. They give us money to have a website, to do partnerships, to do presentations, and also collect feedback from our important constituent group and data user community. So I will do a couple of plugs that on our website, vtlmi.info, you can take a survey. It's like 4 questions, 5 questions, but there's also an open-ended area that if you have ideas of things we should be looking at or research topics or ideas or partnership opportunities, if you can't remember my email address and just want to communicate to us through that survey mechanism, please do, because we're always looking for ways to improve the information that we're sharing to help businesses, to help education, to help job seekers and individuals make the decisions that are best for themselves. So let's move on. Again, thank you all for being here. Everyone's taking time out of their busy day, and whether you are an employer, whether you're a training provider, or whether you are just a community advocate in any capacity, all that is part of the rich nuance that makes Vermont, Vermont, and that is all much appreciated. So thank you. Quick disclaimer, I'm not here representing the Department of Labor, so if I share an opinion, then it is mine and mine alone. And now let's get into the data. And if you see me present before, there's a couple of standards that I start with. And lately I've had to start with this one, which is that there's no good time for a global health pandemic. But early 2020 was the worst possible time because the United States had just started its 10-year census, whereby, as dictated in the Constitution, every 10 years we count every person in this country for a complete count. And that really disrupted things early on in the data collection process. It stalled the data. There was actually, the window had to be opened again or not closed in the normal time. And what that's doing, and I'm stumbling on my words on this because I've just learned within the last day some pretty frustrating news that I'll be sharing as we go through. But basically, the production of the 2020 census has been delayed, and ultimately the rollout of that information is going to be delayed a little bit longer than anticipated. And I'll talk about that as we go forward. But that is significant to our conversation because ultimately, my division, you want to have the best data you can to make decisions, and we'll talk about why the delay in the 2020 census could impact our quality of data for a little bit. So we have partial results though, and we can highlight those. We're going to start, this is a demographics or a workforce focused conference. So let's talk about that. So every 10 years, there's a census, we do a count. And then in between those 10 years, they do 1-year estimates. And then at the end of the 10 years, they do another count. And then the 1-year estimates resume. So we had a 2010 count that put us around 626,000 people. And for the 10 years between 2010 and 2020, that estimate just kind of up and down a little bit, up 0.1%, down 0.1%, up 0.1%, down 0.1%. It showed basically flat population growth for the state of Vermont for a decade. When they compiled the 2020 numbers, they found we had a population of 643,000. And I think it was Tino who mentioned earlier, 643,000 is not even big enough to get us on the top 20 largest cities in the country. But for us, that increase of 17,000 people, which we did not anticipate, was unexpected and for some really good news. And the question started as well, how are we different now? And this is where things get a little bit stalled, is because the breakdown of this new population of 643,000 has been delayed and has not kind of rolled through all the way to the state statistical model. So we're still trying to understand, who are these 17,000 people that we did not anticipate? Are they under the age of 18, or are they all over the age of 65? This is the type of stuff that would kind of better inform public policy if we had greater detail about this population increase. The one thing that I think is important to highlight that we do have from the top line partial results is that in 2010, 5% of Vermont's population identified as not white. And the census forms, I'm referencing basically census designations. There's a category of white alone, and then there's a couple of other categories like Black, more than one race, Hispanic, Asian. I can't think of all of them off the top of my head. But if we gather all of them besides the white, in 2010, to repeat, in 2010, 5% of Vermont's population identified as in the not white category. Well, by 2020, 10% of Vermont's population identified as not white, which means that in 2010, 1 out of every 20 people identified as not white. Now in 2020, 1 out of every 10. And so that is a significant shift in our population over a short 10-year period of time. So when you hear conversations about increasing diversity, increasing where you're recruiting from, this is so important and so key. And this is how the data backs that, because we've seen a tremendous population growth in the not white category. And we're going to go into that more as we go forward. But as a big takeaway right now, I think that's important to highlight. When we look at additionally at the partial results for the population declines across the state, you see 3 counties here, Essex, Caledonia, and Rutland, all actually showing population declines. And while that's not great news, showing those 3 declining over the last 10 years, early estimates was it was going to be Bennington, Windham, Windsor, and possibly even Orange, because remember, we thought we had stagnant population for 10 years, and early estimates showed that those counties, basically the southern portion and the Northeast Kingdom, were all showing actual population declines. We haven't gotten to the workforce component yet, but just from a population standpoint, fewer people. So this when it came out, actually looked like welcome news. There was only 3 counties that had population declines. To put this in perspective, I think the U.S. over the same time 10-year time period grew at about, I think it's 7.6 or 7.8%. So no county in Vermont actually grew as fast as the U.S. Chittenden County and Lamoille County were the closest, with 7.5% in Chittenden and 6% in Lamoille. But you can see the population growth based on the shading is definitely concentrated to the northwestern corner of the state, and that doesn't come to much surprise to a lot of people. But what makes, I think, the biggest surprise from this data is Windham, Windsor counties showing those population growths. And this is where the conversation of COVID starts happening, right? We heard a lot of discussion that people were coming up into Southern Vermont and that the real estate market in Southern Vermont was extremely tight. And that seemed to be one of the first places it really heated up in terms of tight supply during the COVID situation that emerged, that we won't be able to avoid as a topic as we go forward. So as opposed to doing a conclusion at the end, I'm going to do kind of presentation takeaways as we go through. So this economic recovery is different, and it's different for a lot of reasons. And if you see me present before, you've seen this graph. Just for quick reader guidance for those who aren't familiar with it, this is every recession in the United States. So this is US data since World War II. Left to right is months. So that's time, number of months after peak employment. And then up to down is percent job loss. So every economy has been put in percentage terms so you can compare them, because obviously the economy in the 2000s is much different than the economy of the 50s and 60s. But if you put them in percentage terms, you can actually compare them to see how different they are in terms of these economic downturns. And we called this the Great Recession of 2007 because both the depth, how many jobs were lost in the US, and left to right, the duration it took to get the jobs back. So when in the US, when last year or 2 years ago, when we were having these conversations, we were saying at the US, 6 out of every 100 jobs in the US were lost. That was a massive economic downturn. We were looking at it in these terms. In Vermont, during that time period, 4 out of every 100 jobs were lost. And that was, again, a big economic downturn. Well, we hadn't seen anything yet. This is what if you stretch out just Vermont and US from 2007, kind of keep the graph going, you see that they recovered all their jobs both in the US and Vermont around 2014 or so. And we had this long period of economic growth Gus talked about that, the longest period of economic growth in US history. And you can see the blue line, the green line above the zero line showing economic growth. The US obviously growing faster than Vermont. A lot of that has to do with population. But then all of a sudden we get to this one period in time, March 2020 or April 2020, when the data really starts to manifest and you see it's like off the charts. And so if we have now a new recessionary graph we can start. And when we used to talk about, 4 out of every 100 or 6 out of every 100 jobs being lost as a big economic downturn, well, you can see right here that for both Vermont and the US, we're talking much larger scale, right? So Vermont lost 20% in 2 months, 20% of their jobs. So 1 out of every 5 jobs was lost in 2 months. The US lost 15% of their jobs. And you can see how much economic recovery has occurred over these last 18 months. And it has been significant, but it has not been as fast. I mean, Gus talked about it being a rapid return, and in statistical terms it is, but we are still far away. And kind of as evidenced by that, if we just take Vermont's data and we compare 2007's recession to 2020's recession, you can see that where we are at now is where we were at in the worst part of the last recession. And so for some people, they take like that provides them comfort, like, oh, we've been here before, we've recovered from that before, we can do it again. And for others, it's a little kind of disheartening to say, oh my gosh, we're 18 to 20 months into this recession and we're only back to where we were at the worst point of the last recession. So we still do have a ways to go. But what we're capturing here, and this is where our conversation is going to start transitioning into labor force, is that what we're talking about here is jobs filled. And you can see that 5% equals about 15,000 jobs. So Vermont is down about 20,000 jobs or so. And jobs does not equal people, but it's close. So when we talk about job loss, we're only talking about filled positions. And the conversation at the end of the presentation is going to switch to this conversation of unfilled jobs, because that's really critical and important here. And that's another big distinction in this economic downturn. The other thing that we used to talk a lot about during the last economic recovery was that Burlington was doing so much better. The Burlington labor market area was doing so much better than the rest of the state. It was, you've heard me probably say several times if you've seen me present before, urban-based economic recovery. And that was not just a Vermont phenomenon, it was a US phenomenon. That the urban centers across the country were doing better. The rural parts of America were not recovering as fast during the 2007 recession. But here we're seeing actually it's very balanced. So this is our first 2 big takeaways. One, the shape and scale of this economic downturn are unmatched, right? We used to call the other one the Great Recession, and it seems kind of farcical now to call that a Great Recession compared to what we've experienced already thus far in this economic downturn. But 2, the employment gains as the employment has returned are actually balanced between Burlington metropolitan area or the labor market area and the rest of the state, the balance of the state, to the extent the data allows us to see. So those are 2 differences right away that we want to highlight. Now, here we go. Let's talk about labor force. So again, part of our federal partnership with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is done in partnership with the US Census Bureau. We have a program called Local Area Unemployment Statistics, known as LAUS in our world. And what this is done in partnership, as I said, with the census, the current population survey. It is a survey of Vermont households. So we're asking Vermont households questions about their employment status, their job seeking status, and other sorts of socioeconomic questions built on back of the current population survey. So we have a lot of tremendous information associated with their demographics and their race, ethnicity, gender, those type of things. Actually, I should say sex. In the census world, they call it sex, and it's binary. So we're not talking about gender, but maybe someday we'll get to that level of detail. So this data, and I need to warn you, right? We're going to talk about data. This is going to be data. I normally try and avoid data in presentations, but I will say for the data enthusiasts, it's going to be right in front of you. For the people who are not, I encourage you to look out your window, and hopefully just the sound of my voice is not too displeasing, and just kind of hear the stories that are going to come out of this. So for the data people, get your glasses on. For others, this is a story. Economics is always a story. So hopefully this will be a cohesive story that we're going to talk about Vermont's labor force based on the current population survey. So our first one is a graph, and this is where we talk about why this economic recovery is so different, why this economic downturn is so different. The first metric that you normally point to when you talk about economic downturns is the unemployment rate. Well, we can see right now that our unemployment rate is 2.6%. Actually, we released yesterday. I didn't want to update these because timing and things like that. But yesterday we actually announced 2.5%. So we actually had a 1/10 of a percentage point decline yesterday. But for all intents and purposes, we're talking about mid 2% unemployment rate, which puts us at pre-pandemic levels. That's the pink line is the unemployment rate, and the blue blob is the number of unemployed people in the state of Vermont. And we're around 8,000 unemployed people, which again puts us at pre-pandemic levels. But I just told you we're at like the worst part of the last economic recession. So we have not in any way recovered to where we were. Yet these data metrics indicate we have. So this kind of is a big thing of saying, well, by the unemployment rate or the number of unemployed people as defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that normally is a good Q&A question is like, let's talk about what the Bureau of Labor Statistics definition is of unemployed. And we can do that in a little bit. But basically, you have to be actively looking for work and willing to accept work if offered. But the point here is that these metrics show we're back to where we were. And I think it's, especially in light of the conversations we were having the last couple of days, it's important to recognize that back to where we were does not always mean equal for everyone, right? I think Gus was talking about income inequality in his presentation and how it has kind of diverged and increased over the last couple of years. And so if we look at the unemployment rate, and it gets a little tricky here because our sample is so limited that we have to look at annual averages here. So I'm no longer talking about monthly data, I'm talking about annual averages. But I've grabbed the annual average for the white population, Hispanic population, and Black population for the year before COVID, and then our most recent year, calendar year 2021. So we have calendar year 2019 compared to calendar year 2021. And you can see that 2021 was an elevated level of unemployment. A lot of this is coming down, right? Over the last 6 months, the unemployment rate is coming down. So this year-long trend will be pulling down. But will it be pulling down for everybody? And will it be pulling down equally? So we can see white unemployment 2.2%, now at 3.5% based on this annual metric. Hispanic actually showed the Hispanic population actually showed a decline in their unemployment rate from 3.4% to 1.3%. But the Black population is the one I'm highlighting here because the unemployment rate pre-pandemic, when we had a tight labor market condition during the longest period of economic expansion, their unemployment rate was 5.5%. And that is high from a standpoint of where we were at, economically speaking. And it has only increased during 2021, now at 5.9%. So when we talk about the unemployment rate, I think it's important to recognize that the experiences of people in the labor market are not always equal. There's a lot of research and discussions about all of these things, and so we won't have as much time to get into the research and the theory. But I think it's important to recognize that this does not mean that everybody is experiencing the same low level of unemployment. Now, this is the metric that I've been focusing on for this particular economic downturn, because as I said, the unemployment rate and the number of unemployed is not as illuminating. So here what we have is two lines, the blue line being the labor force in the state of Vermont, and the second line being the number of employed. And this is, again, per Vermonters and Vermont household data. And you can see that in approximately 2009, the labor force in Vermont peaked at 361,000. And that was during the economic downturn that we've already talked about in our rear view mirror at this point. So from that point forward, you can see a slow, steady decline in our labor force from a peak of 361 down to just over 340,000, so about 343,000. So from 2010 to 2019, we lost that nearly 20,000 people just from natural people leaving the labor force for whatever reasons. Could be better economic conditions and whatnot. But here you can see just in the last 2 years what's happened. Our labor force has contracted and we've dropped another 25,000 over the span of 2 months. And this is the biggest economic question I think we're facing today is like, what is going on? Who are these people that left the labor market? Will they be coming back? And as I said, we do this census every 10 years. And that is the bedrock for which these models are built on. And I learned yesterday that we had been planning that this 2020 census would be incorporated into our economic models this March, that we would be getting better and improved data about the characteristics of the Vermont labor force this March. But due to delays in the production side on the US Census Bureau, I'm now hearing noise as of yesterday that we might not be able to do that. We might have to go another year with our current models. I actually have a 12 o'clock appointment right after this presentation with my federal partners. And believe me, I am going to kick up a dust storm like you wouldn't imagine if that is the truth. Because as I just shared, A, we have 17,000 more people than we anticipated. So at a minimum, we need to incorporate that. But B, even if we incorporate the 17,000 more people that we have across our entire population, I just told you the BIPOC community, or let's identify them as the not white population, doubled in the last 10 years. We cannot go another year of using a statistical model based on 5% of our population being identified as non-white. We know it is 10% of our population, and we need our statistical models to capture that so that we can have better quality data to better inform businesses, policymakers, education, whoever. But the normal course of action is it would be the year following the 2020 census, or 2 years following, because of all the work they have to do to get down to state level data. So we were, for the last 6 months, I've been talking about how in March 2022, we are going to get better quality data. And that's now in question now. And I haven't even told my boss yet. He's going to be not pleased. So anyway, back to our topic. You don't need to worry about my data world and how sad I am about some of the things I've just learned. So we talk about this downward pressure about our labor force in Vermont, and I'm highlighting at the bottom here that the leading edge of the baby boomers turned 65 in 2011. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that we had that downward pressure on our labor force between 2011 and 2019. And some quick addition tells you that the leading edge of the baby boomers in 2021 were turning 75. And the labor force participation rate of people over 75 is much, much lower than people over the age of 65. And so some of this decline in our labor force that we've seen recently could be demographic. But we also know there's a lot of other stories about there related to COVID about individuals with childcare issues or health concerns, or the other one I think about is change in lifestyle, right? We're hearing a lot of people reevaluate their entire how they live, how they make ends meet. Maybe you were in a 2-income household before and had a pretty, moderate to high income lifestyle. But then you said, you know what, if only one of us works, we can have a modest lifestyle and be more self-sufficient. And one of us doesn't have to even be in the labor force anymore. And so I think we're hearing a lot more about those changes for individuals. And so for here, there's a lot of questions about who these people are and when will they come back, if they will come back to the labor force. Back to county level data, I'm just going to highlight that for the labor force, we talked about the population changes in by county, population changes by county, but for the labor force, 8 counties are actually showing declines of 10%. Most counties, 13 of 14 counties had a peak labor force of 2009, 10, or 11. Chittenden County had a peak labor force of, I think, 2019. So it was much, much later. But even Chittenden County is showing declines in its labor force now. But of those 8 counties showing, of the 13 counties showing declines, 8 of them are showing declines over 10%. Of those 8, 6 of those counties are showing declines over 15%. And again, highlighting Bennington, Caledonia, Essex, Rutland, Windham, and Windsor, those being the 6 counties that have showed the greatest decline in their labor force. The 3 in red are the ones that we talked about already that had a population decline accompanying their labor force decline. Bennington, Windham, Windsor report population increases, even though they had significant declines in their labor force, which might imply that maybe the population gains they're receiving in those counties are actually potentially mature workers or people who've even retired. Okay, so labor force participation rate. Now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the data. The old story in Vermont used to be, we have an older population, but we're highly educated. We're more educated than the US overall. As a result, education correlates really high with labor force participation. We have a high labor force participation rate because, again, the education, the age, the profile of our individuals. But is it now a new story, and we don't know this yet, we're still waiting on the completion, the full integration of the 2020 census, a significant portion of Vermont's population is now aged out of the labor force. One of the big differences in this particular economic downturn versus the last one is asset prices have remained really high. And Gus talked about this. In 2009, at the depths of the last recession, housing prices were not at all-time highs. The stock market was not at all-time highs, and that is the current situation now. And so it's a much different financial landscape for individuals who might be choosing to stay in the workforce or not. So our labor force participation rate has dropped about 5 percentage points. And because of the way the labor force participation rate is calculated, it's based on everyone 16 and older. And so 16 and older are in the basket, basically. Some other smaller tweaks to that, but for this discussion, let's just say 16 and older. And if a significant portion of our population is now, 80, 75, even over 70, then that is going to put downward pressure on our labor force participation rate. And right now, we are actually lower than the US by a smidge. So our labor force participation rate, even though we may be a highly educated population, it is not bearing out in the labor force. And that could be, again, demographics is a big part of the narrative that we've had for the last 5-10 years, right? Talking about demographics. Well, this is what we've been talking about. We're seeing it now materialize. So again, baby boomers turning 75 in 2021. And then on the flip side, when you look at if people are exiting the labor force, who's coming in, we've had low birth rates in Vermont for several decades. And we've seen that bear out in the discussion in school age population and the state of Vermont being declining school age populations. But it's also bearing out in the labor force participation rates. In the mid 2000s, our labor force participation rate used to be around 60%. Pre-COVID, we were at least above 45%, and now we're down to 40%. So for 16 and 19-year-olds, it's becoming less and less common, less likely than not that they will actually be in the labor force. And it could be a function of health concerns, or it could be just the demands of current schooling, or just the mixed bag of it all doesn't allow for school and work, a whole bunch of factors here at play. But from an economist standpoint, the labor force participation rate of your youth is a big indicator of who's going to be joining later and what skills they're going to have. So if individuals are postponing getting their first job until they're 25 or even later, depending on their educational path, they're not going to have the same experience level. They may have a tremendous educational level, but they're not going to have the same professional experience, that soft skills. They might not understand kind of like the working culture of a workplace. And that can be to the benefit or a detriment of an organization, depending on how your business functions and how its corporate culture is, right? If you are can accommodate those kind of like a new modern approach to that, well, then you might be just fine. But if you have a very stuck in the ways, kind of, this is the way we clock in, this is the way we communicate via email, this is how you respond via voicemail, then it's possible individuals without previous professional experience are going to need some training in that regard. And it might seem a little unusual to do that level of training, but they'll have extremely technical skills, but just might not have that, that soft skills that your company expects. Now, talking about the recession from a sex standpoint, again, it says gender, and I wish we had more data on gender. Unfortunately, it comes down a lot of times to binary male, female. This was dubbed the she session because women were disproportionately impacted for two reasons. One, the industries hit the hardest tended to have a higher concentration of women, or that's what the data bears out. But less so for Vermont, but more to the storyline, occupationally, the occupations that were impacted were more concentrated in women. This is why diversity across the economy is so important, right? So that individuals or groups, so whether it's by sex or race or ethnicity, you don't want individuals all in certain types of employment, whether that's industry or occupation, because if that industry suffers, then you now have a whole population, a whole cohort of people that are going to be disproportionately impacted. And that doesn't lead to good economic results, right? We want, we never like to have an economic downturn, but if it can be spread across everyone, it makes it a lot easier to go through. It makes it a lot easier to formulate public policy and these type of things. The second thing that how women were disproportionately impacted was the disruptions to childcare and education. We talked a little bit about that too, where COVID has been a major disruption to these things. And though there's been tremendous economic gains for women in the marketplace as it relates to labor force participation, employment, and even earnings, One of the things that has not changed as much is the time and use surveys that get put out regarding how women what roles and responsibilities women are in charge of in the household. And they continue to make up a large share of household responsibilities, particularly around childcare and that type of support service. So when the education institutions needed to shut down or childcare needed to shut down, it was a lot of time women who disproportionately bared the brunt of that hardship. So what does recovery look like for this population? That's a standing question too. And we've seen some of the data bounce back when we look at like how labor force participation rates in certain industries. We've seen some of that, but ultimately, I think a lot of this might even be dictated by public policy. There's a lot of conversations in Vermont and at the national level about how public policy could actually improve the outcomes for certain groups. So a breakdown just to kind of show you what we're looking at here. This is where, again, I have to switch to calendar year data because the data is not robust enough to talk about it on a monthly basis, which means anytime I'm talking about calendar year data, it means the margins of error are a lot larger too, because there's not as much statistical confidence in this information. But again, best information available. We can see the labor force participation rate for women declining from 62.5% to 59 and 59.4%. And where we see the biggest declines is actually for females 16 to 19 and 20 to 24. And those are some large declines in their labor force participation. So for 16 to 19, going from about 50% participation to a third, or for the 20 to 24, where 3/4 of all women were in the labor force between the age of 20 and 24, to now just 2 out of every 3. So you see that's a significant change. Over the last year or so, we've actually seen slight increases for females 25 to 44, that double cohort rate in there. We've seen some positive. The rest are all pretty stable between 2019 and 2021. But this has been the concentration where the decline has happened. Interestingly, if we switch to men, they have higher labor force participation rates, about 70% in 2019. But they've dropped 5% according to the data in 2021 to just being under 65%. And there was actually 3 cohorts of note for men that had significant declines, and they were 20 to 34, that bandwidth, where you see pretty noticeable declines. But also on the back end, 55 to 64. And I think some of this is, again, potentially related to COVID, the industry compositions that men typically work in. If you think about construction, if you think about mining, if you think about manufacturing, ones that might have a more physical toll on the body. So you get into an upper cohort, mature workers, 55 to 64, showing a significant pullback in their labor force participation rate. Could be due to health concerns or phasing out of the workforce altogether, meaning retirement. And hopefully it could be temporary, but it could also mean permanent retirement. We don't know. And this is what we're waiting on to see who comes back into the labor force. So when we switch to race and look at labor force participation rates, you can see Hispanics have declined the Hispanic population has gone from 71% to 67%. But again, I'm highlighting the Black population. Calendar year 2019, just over 3/4 of that population was in the labor force, but now under 2/3, now it's 63%. So that is a significant change. Again, this data is pretty jumpy, but we are just talking about, there's no way I would present age cohort data by race because it is way too jumpy. But even at the aggregated, at the highest level we can to look at what the data available for race is, this is showing a significant pullback in the labor force. And you put this on top of the story we had about high unemployment rates, this would be on top of that, because to be considered unemployed, you have to be in the labor force. But if we have a significant decline of people actually in the labor force and we have elevated levels of unemployment, you now have both people who are looking for work and can't find it, and then people who are completely out of the labor force from this population. And that, again, raises concerns from a public policy standpoint, public health standpoint, on how do we, what type of things need to happen to re-engage this population to get them back in labor force. And it could be totally reasonable barriers on the individual level related to COVID or healthcare or childcare or any of these things. But this is the questions that I think are the ones that, they fall outside of my realm, but I'm just trying to highlight them as questions that we need to kind of better understand to help inform public policy or programs and things like this, to understand why that decline has happened, and to the extent it can be reversed if that's a better outcome than this. I don't profess to know what's a good outcome or bad outcome, but this is just a big change when you look at labor force participation rate by race, where you see about a 13 percentage point drop for this one cohort of Vermonters. So what we also know, and we talked a little bit about from the 2020 census, is that the growing populations are non-white, and this is particularly among youth. So the future of Vermont's labor force will be greater racial and ethnic diversity. And so I think from an employer standpoint, what we've heard for the last 2 days is the time is now to ensure that your workplace is supportive, is recruiting, is doing all it can, if you have a labor force challenge, to expose yourself to the labor that's out there and the talent that's out there, because this is going to be where there's opportunities for tremendous growth. And I'm just going back a slide here because, you put this together, some of this decline in the labor force participation rate for Blacks could be that there's so many more youths in the 16 to 19 age that it's pulling down prior estimates. So it could again be a function of just the age and how this calculation is done. But when we talk about the future of Vermont's labor force, there's going to be greater racial and ethnic diversity. And I think that's like just a big takeaway for what we need to understand. And when it comes through for recruitment. So I just want to congratulate people. You made it through the data portion here. And now I'm just going to zip through for a couple more things. I know we want to be mindful of time because there is a healthy portion of Q&A. So let's do 2 more presentation takeaways. One, this economic recovery is different because there's more attention paid to the status quo. Coming out of the 2000s, and what I mean by that is coming out of the 2007 recession, no, there wasn't as much discussion about income inequality, or there wasn't as much discussion about how the BIPOC community is doing coming out of this economic recovery. So when we talk about the differences in unemployment rates by race, when we talk about the difference in labor force participation rates by sex, I think there's more attention paid to the quote unquote status quo, and understanding that maybe going back to what we had isn't the answer, and understanding that we need to make sure all populations are exposed to the economic growth that is going on around our state and around this country. And how do we ensure that? Because that is going to ultimately ensure a healthier, more vibrant economy and Vermont, ensuring that no one is left behind when we talk about economic recovery. So I think there's much more attention paid to the status quo, and that's why I put it in quotes. Number 4 here is there's been a big change in preferences, and we talked about this. They dubbed it the big quit across the U.S., where as opposed to working, hashtag van life, this is how, this is me for a while. I don't know what my next step is, but for right now, it's not working. And so in Vermont, I think we are getting indications of the big quit happening, but we also might be experiencing the big retirement because, as discussed several times throughout these last 2 days, Vermont does profile, the average Vermonter does profile older than the average American. So this is part of the American narrative. We're just ahead of the curve in that regard. And so you can see these last couple slides here, and then I'll be turning it back over to Renee. I just want to highlight quits data. Quits data is a funny little data point that economists love to talk about, and it's normally counter-cyclical, meaning the stronger the economy is, the more quits there are. So during an economic downturn, like say in 2007 or through 2009, you can see in 2009, there's like a down point right there because no one was quitting their job because the economy was in a terrible state of affairs. And you can see from 2010 forward, the quits rate actually starts walking up and increasing and improving, quote unquote, because the economy is improving. So as quits increase, then you start thinking the economy is healthy enough because people are saying, you know what, I can find a new job, I'm just going to quit. Well, you see that the quits drop off the table as soon as COVID happens, right? No one was quitting their job. A lot of people were getting fired. And if you look at the separations data, it's actually an inverse. You can see a tremendous increase in separations at this time because so many people were fired. We talked about 20% decline in employment in those 2 months. But you can see the quits rate now has come way back to pre-pandemic levels and is actually higher than it had been in the last 10, 15 years. So our quits rate is as high as it's ever been. It's tough to tell on this graph, but the latest observation is 10,000 quits in a month. So for quits data, that is high for the state of Vermont, and that's the statistical estimate. 10,000 quits happened in November, I think, or it might have been October, because this data's got an extra 1 month lag. The other thing I want to highlight, and this is a big takeaway, and the biggest takeaway, and something I want to leave for food for thought, number of job openings, right? So you can see job openings are one of those things that are also thought of, or is not thought of as countercyclical, but pro-cyclical. So it goes with the economy. So you can see in 2009, 2010, the job openings were very low in the state of Vermont. But you walk this forward, the economy is doing better, job openings are increasing, employers are having trouble recruiting. Pre-pandemic, we talked about a low unemployment rate, tight labor market conditions, increasing wage pressure because of the competition for labor. And then COVID comes along and did us no favors, right? It only heightened the intensity and competition for labor. And now you can see job openings surging. And so what makes this such a different economic recovery is that when we're at the depths of our economic downturn, the job openings are through the roof. Meaning, in 2007, 2008, 2009, companies were not hiring, right? And so people were out of work. That population is high. We have a tremendous amount of unemployed people, a tremendous amount of labor slack, and job postings were few and far between. You march it forward to this current recession, our labor force is tight. Job postings are through the roof. And so we start focusing not on labor demand, but on labor supply. So it is not a function that employers are not trying to hire. In fact, the hiring data shows that they're at record highs. To correspond with that 10,000 quits, there's 15,000 hires during that month of October 2021, meaning for every 3 hires that were made, 2 quit. And if you're an employer out there trying to hire, that's the experience you're feeling. So every time you can fill a position, it's almost like you have another one open. So for every 3 hires made, 2 quits happened. And so we start looking at this conversation of labor supply, and which is why I think this conversations that we've had for the last 2 days is so, so important. How do we increase awareness about the high pay, high demand jobs in the state of Vermont? Not all of them require training outside of high school. I know that's how this brochure is being presented these days. Training indicates on the job training, not necessarily organized training. You can have a high school degree and qualify for many employment opportunities right in the state of Vermont. But a high school degree is really much a key to success. And then beyond that, being that lifelong learner, learning new skills, learning new talents that you can use in the open marketplace to augment your wages. The other program done in partnership with the McCrorey is this Best Bets training programs. So highlights 7 programs in the state of Vermont that directly lead to employment in the state of Vermont. So we're doing our best to open to ideas. Again, please complete that customer survey or reach out to me directly at my email or call me on the phone. We're a small state. We can talk about things. We can have open, honest discussions. We're all trying to figure out how best to ensure individuals are making the best decision for themselves about their economic stability and security. Renee.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. I loved the data. It was great. We do have some questions in the chat and or in the Q&A, and I'll try to filter through these. One quick one I think that came in late, but since it was one of your last slides, I thought maybe we could tackle that first, and that is, do the quits include retirements?
Yes, they potentially would include retirements.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the data does not align to other data programs where we can't break it out. I have like a little sunshine on me. Yes, it would include retirements potentially.
Okay, great. All right, from William Winstead, do these numbers take into effect someone outside of Vermont working in Vermont, and the same scenario for Vermonters working in bordering states? Does that affect much of the discussion? And I think there's going to be several of these questions about where do you reside versus where do you work, which is quite changing in this environment.
Yes, and it's an excellent question. And anytime someone presents you survey data, the way I always tell people look at it is like, think about who's answering the question and what information they can share, right? So to the answer to that question, it depends on the data, because there's 2 different data sources we talked about there. We focused a lot on the household survey data, and that one is going to capture Vermonters who live in Vermont. and regardless of where they're employed. So the question comes to you as your Vermont household. So this is your labor force, your unemployment data, saying, hey, did you work? And you say yes or no. So the household survey captures Vermont residents. The business survey asks businesses, how many people do you have on payroll, not where do they live? So when we talk about the Vermont economy losing 20% of all jobs, that's coming from a business survey. So it's a mixed bag, right? So if you are, if you work in Vermont, but don't live in Vermont, you're going to be captured in the business survey portion. If you are a resident of Vermont, but work out of state, like all the remote workers, you're going to be captured in the household survey data.
Next question from Adam Grinold. How current is the data for youth participation? And you had some slide on there, some slides on this, but has the data shown an increase over the last 8 months? Anecdotally, this summer saw a significant increase in teen labor in our region. Wondering if there's a lag in youth data.
Great question, Adam, appreciate it. The data, because it does a 12-month moving average, it blends all the months together. And so you can kind of see the trail. And when I dug into the data, what's interesting is that males 16 and 19 have shown actually an increase in their labor force participation rate, but females have shown such a large decline. And that's the data we were looking at, I think, dropping from 50% labor force participation rate for women 16 and 19 to about 33%. That is what's dominating the aggregate 16 and 19-year-olds. So 16 and 19-year-olds are still showing a decline, but it's driven by women in that age cohort exiting the labor force versus men entering the labor force. So it's actually the current data indicates that there's a distinction made by sex.
Interesting. Any thoughts on what causes that?
Oh, I don't know. There's been a lot of excellent work, and I've heard. I don't know what's right or wrong. Again, I'll just caveat that that's fact. I don't know what's right or wrong, but there's been a lot of excellent work in promoting career and education awareness for women in the state of Vermont. The Change of the Story work was excellent. If you're not familiar with them, I really encourage you to reach out and learn about their work, because they did some fantastic work. As an aside, some of the saddest statistics I've seen over the last couple of years, or I'd say over my decade of tenure with the Department of Labor, one, labor force participation rate for youth has been declining. And that for me is not something I like to see, because I think it really informs individuals about their future jobs and their education path. But two, occupational segregation has not improved. It's only gotten worse, meaning the occupations that are typically, quote unquote, filled by men have only gotten more male-centric, and occupations that are typically filled by women are only more female-centric. And so that has been some of the most disappointing news to learn. And so I think there's been this is all rounding back to the question of, like, I think there's been a lot of engagement with young women about education and training. And I could see that there being a greater focus on education and training there. And for young boys who we know their frontal cortex doesn't complete its formation until 25, they could just be saying, buttons to school, I'm going to go work. And that could be the result of COVID, because of the employment opportunities that are so readily apparent, and their just lack of lack of ability to thrive in an education institution right now. And that's what I would say, is that why there might be divergence, and that's just complete pie in the sky. And I would appreciate anyone else's input or alternative theories. Oh, thank you, Lily. Yes, change the story in the chat.
Hi there, Matt. It's Betsy Bishop with the Vermont Chamber. How are you?
Yes, we've met once or twice before, Betsy. Good to see you again.
I'm popping in here. It looks like we lost Renee. When we get Renee back, she'll pop back in. But I just want to both the chat and the Q&A are quite active. So there's one question in the chat I'm just going to pull over from Liz DeMarco Weinman, who we've been working with on the diversity and equity issues around the Declaration of Inclusion. And she was wondering about how many professionals have left the traditional 9-to-5 positions to start their own businesses, and how they're counted in your data. Are sole proprietors counted as working? Are they counted in the workforce? She says, just because someone is over 50 does not mean they are not working. I moved my consulting practice to Vermont in 2018. 2020. Yay, thank you for coming to Vermont, and officially registered here in 2021, but work with clients throughout the US.
Well, I just want to applaud you, A, for moving here, but B, being the example that we're trying to highlight of you can live in Vermont and have clients across the globe, right? Being a technical expert in any sort of field, regardless of what that is a great opportunity. So again, it kind of comes down on the two, the different sources of where the data comes from. If you are self-employed, there's a good chance you're not going to be counting the business survey data because you're not required to provide unemployment insurance for yourself. And that's how the Vermont Department knows who to contact when we do business services, business surveys, is that you are the people who have to cover people by unemployment insurance. So if you were self-employed and elected to cover yourself through the unemployment insurance system, which you can do, then you would be in our basket. We would know about you. If not, then we wouldn't. But if you are a resident of Vermont, you would be in the household survey data saying, yes, I'm employed in Vermont, and you'd be counted there. To the greater point about how the transition has happened between self-employed and working, we don't have the data yet. But as just an illustrative story for what happened during the 2007 recession was fascinating, because the US Census Bureau really rolled up their sleeve to figure out what happened to the self-employed. And what we saw is an exact match of the percentage of people who numerically, the number of people who were self-employed and said, you know what, this economic downturn has just, crushed my business and I don't want to run my own business anymore. I'm going to get a job. It was the exact match as the same number of people who said the exact opposite. I'm sick of working for someone else. I am going to start my own business. And it was almost like a complete wash. They showed this little graph that went, and they just crossed over the two lines, and they were equal across the country. We don't have any Vermont specific data on that, but those type of things, they tend to have that a similar effect for different reasons on populations, where they say, I don't want to work for anyone anymore. I'm going to start my own business, versus I'm tired of running my own business. I just want a job or be someone else, let someone else be the boss. So I don't have the data on this most recent economic downturn, but it is an excellent point to bring up and something to consider.
There's a couple questions in the Q&A, Matt, about data. And if you already answered them with Renee, just sort of flag that and we'll move on. There's quite a few questions in here, but there's a question in here about, do quits include retirements? And then There's also a question about the what's the recent level of the youth participation data that was kind of shocking that you presented, and just curious, was that through last summer, or is that more current, or is it later?
Yeah, yes, the quits data will cover retirements. And I should mention that during the previous administration, I was on the Governor's Commission for Successful Aging. And so mature workers are something that's near and dear to my heart, having worked, for a couple of years on that project, and really want to emphasize Liz's point that, mature workers, whether you're over 50, over 60, over 70, there's tremendous opportunities there. And I really encourage employers, when you're posting jobs that you're having difficulty filling, think about how the job might be able to be broken up into different skill sets, different baskets of tasks, and target different populations for those. So it might be that a position that used to be just one job, one person, could be broken up in a mature worker who's just looking for part-time work, could take on the client relationship aspect of it, and the technical aspects could be, potentially filled through an internship or some sort of partnership with a local college, university, or even high school. So just think about how those things can get done differently. For youth, it's calendar year 2021 is the most recent data. Calendar year 2021 showed a 40% labor force participation rate for 16 to 19-year-olds. And females were only about 33%, and men were just over like 47%. I think they make up the balance, but still under 50% for both of them. So it's, from my era, it was always school and work. It was not one or the other. That's just, again, I don't know if that's right or wrong, but maybe I should have focused more on school, or I don't know, but it was always both. And that's not seeming to be the case these days.
Great. Well, thank you. And for just an update on Renee, her office actually lost internet, so she's not going to be coming back with us. But so you're all stuck with me. So Matt, we'll just continue the conversation. I see that Jen Galfetti from Union Mutual has posted a question about piggybacking off of the prior presentation on which touched on the lack of housing availability. If we were to overlay housing availability over job openings historically to present, is there some correlation that you can speak to?
That's an interesting one. That's a question I haven't thought of.
You know, it's interesting because we've been doing some work in that area too around housing and looking at, you know, how many jobs are open. Like if you think about that affordability and the jobs that are posted, for instance, that are, you know, of a X salary range, and then what that could afford for a house, there's many jobs available, obviously, but the housing is just not available in that same sort of what we call that missing middle area. So that would be interesting. I don't know if you have data on that.
Yeah, and that's not an area of expertise. Within my shop, we all have kind of like little sub-disciplines, and the assistant director of the division, Kevin Stapleton, is our housing expert. So I wish he was here to kind of share his thoughts. I will say there was just an article in Vermont Digger about some testimony done at the State House where they were talking about what at the price ranges of what individuals could afford. What they were finding is that they're having difficulty securing loans because the banks were finding out that if the property was selling for $200,000, it might need $100,000 worth of work. And then therefore they were having difficulty getting the property underwritten. And therefore you have this problem where if you can't afford to buy something, if your starter home is $200,000, but you need $100,000 of work, that might, you know, prevent you from being in the housing market, basically, because it automatically pushes you up to that 300,000 range.
That's great. And for all the attendees, you should know that we are going to be continuing this conversation in a Google Doc form post session. So if your questions don't get answered here, or in that case, that question, we can follow up with other people and then put that in that. So you'll be getting that link from us in the post conference communication that we'll send out. So just looking, Darcy Carter from the SBA has got a question in here about some of the loss of the population and people under 30 looking for better professional opportunities. Is that what they're doing there in that under 30 category? It seems Vermont could still use a much wider variety of jobs for college graduates that are not healthcare or IT. And I will say that, you know, the Futures Project has done some looking at this, and, you know, I think the number is only 26% of the jobs in Vermont need a four-year college degree. So to Darcy's point, I'm curious if you want to comment on that, Matt.
Yeah, I think, you know, Vermont, the landscape has definitely changed in the last year or two. And so my talking points of how I used to talk about things like this in 2018 or 2019, my ideas, I should say, not talking points, my ideas around the topic are growing and evolving because we're in a new economic reality. But what I always found was the greatest challenge in Vermont was that, and strength, is our size at times. And, you know, encouraging young people to recognize that just because it isn't, you know, in the Fortune 500s doesn't mean what you want to do isn't here. Take me, for example. When I moved back here, I didn't think I would find a professional economist gig in the private sector for someone who is doing, you know, work across the globe, right? And, you know, it was a small place, but it was doing exactly what I wanted to do. And it was just like, you know, so we don't know what's going on in every business that's down Route 7 or what you drive by. I wonder what's going on in that, you know, industrial complex. And trying to, you know, it can take a little bit of asking around or just kind of making yourself a little bit vulnerable and saying what you're looking for. But, you know, right now I'm not seeing any sort of employment opportunities that are not available if you can look around for them. You know, so I know it does seem like IT and healthcare dominate, and some of that is the way that online job markets work, is that those, for whatever reason, really just hammer the online job markets and they can really dominate a conversation. But pulling back behind those, you will find a lot of opportunities in different things. But for the broader point, I don't think it's a population exit of the under 30 population in Vermont that have left. I think it is more constraints to do with childcare or healthcare concerns or change in lifestyle for why we're seeing the labor force participation rate drop. But again, this is all, we're flying by the best data available, and we're still waiting for that 2020 census to be fully unveiled to us down to age cohorts, by sex, by race, ethnicity. We're still waiting on all that additional level of data for the state of Vermont.
That's great. So just a time check, we have about 10 minutes left and we have about 7 questions. And like I said, so we're going to go into the speed round, Matt.
Okay.
So Russell Flannery, pardon?
Hand on buzzer. I'm ready.
No, it's good. Like I said, we have a way of answering all these questions afterwards too. So Russell Flannery is asking a question about the 2020 census data. The Vermont population, at least for the 2020 census data, 94% white, 2% Hispanic Latino, 1.4% Black or African American, 1.9% Asian. There's been little discussion of Asian American Vermonters, though their percentage is relatively large. If my recollection serves me, I think Russell Flannery's done quite a bit of reporting in China for certain. Why don't you break down that group in your discussion? How do they fit into the demographic trends, same or different?
That is where my data stops, unfortunately. I don't have access to the information. So our survey, it's not our survey, the survey done in partnership with the current population survey, the questions, they don't get broken out. So I guess they do not have adequate data to state on that. I think there might be unemployment rate, but I didn't see labor force participation. I could dig in that and I would be happy to follow up on that should that data be just unknown to me, and I just need to look a little harder. But as it's reported right now, it was not a category within race or ethnicity that we have readily available to us. But I can reach out to the census.
Great. There's a question here about wage data that can be shared. We will be sending out again the presentations and that. So for folks who are looking for that data, we will be sending that out to you. Elizabeth Frascoya asks, regarding youth, how does this relate to the current data about high school graduation and post-secondary enrollment and credential attainment?
Oh, that's a big conversation right now. And I know it's been going on for a couple of years now. And you know, my biggest thing about this is, you know, I think for a little while there was a narrative that 4-year college for everyone, and that was the barometer of success. And I'm just glad that we've moved away from that conversation. As I said earlier on my language, when I talk about the partnership we've done with the McCrorey Foundation, I talk about minimum high school education, then I talk about career technical education, I talk about apprenticeships, I talk about the opportunities that are available that will pay good wages for short periods of training. And with apprenticeships, there's a good chance you actually can get paid while you're learning. And I know that there is a goal out there of getting the state to 70% of the population having a meaningful credential. I think there's a lot of discussion about what that means, a meaningful credential. For some, a meaningful credential could be a CDL. Having a commercial driver's license could be a game changer for an individual household and their income strategy. But for others, that might not be what a certificate of value is in their definition. So I don't know how they're going to all define all that. I just know it is something, a charge. And for me, I think what young people need to hear is that there's opportunities in Vermont, but you need to be a lifelong learner. Right. And that goes for every one of us in this room. There's new platforms, there's new technology, there's even new techniques, there's new even theories being developed all the time. And, you know, thinking that you're done high school and now I'm going to get a job and work for 40 or 50 years, maybe you'll be successful in that. But understanding that through that 40 or 50 years, you will have a tremendous amount of learning that will happen, whether it's in a formal education setting or not. So for me, it is high school minimum, and then lifelong learning, whatever that looks like for you, whatever makes sense for you. And I wouldn't discourage anyone from going right into the workforce out of high school or pursuing career technical education or apprenticeships.
So there's a pretty vibrant conversation going on in the legislature right now around career and technical education, and that's something the Vermont Chamber is involved in. You can certainly contact us for more information on that. The other organization that would be helpful here is Advance Vermont, talking about the credentialing that Matt just mentioned as well. So, there was Erica Hoffman-Kais has mentioned something about newcomers to the state and labor participation. Will that data be disaggregated in some way going forward as the influx of evacuees reaches Vermont? If so, yes, and when? And then also Roxanne VBSR is asking, do we know how many people already in Vermont are available for roughly those 23,000 job openings? If you could maybe put those two together.
Sure. So all our statistical data is based. All our statistical data is based on at its core is the 10-year census, and then these 1-year updates they do through the American Community Survey. So anyone who moves to Vermont, will be captured through the census. And what we're waiting on right now is the full breakout of the 2020. So anybody who's moving here, the thing we won't have is once they live in Vermont, they're called a Vermonter, right? We don't go back like, oh, have you been here a year, 2, 3 years? There has been some efforts, I know, through the Vermont Department of Taxes and some partnerships they've done to look at new filers in the state of Vermont. And I'm not sure the status of that work, if they're going to be doing it. But they've looked at who are new filers in the state of Vermont to see if they can better understand who's moving here and who's not moving here, like who didn't file this year versus last year, that type of thing. So that's a good question. And then can you remind me, Roxanne's
Sure,
question?
the 23,000 job openings,
oh, yes.
How many people are available?
So this is where we get into the Bureau of Labor Statistics definition of unemployed. To be unemployed, you have to be not working. You also have to be looking for work, and then able and willing to accept work if offered. And that population is 8,000 right now. However, we also talked about there's 25,000 people approximately who've left the labor force completely, meaning they can't meet the criteria of unemployed. So it's possible that these are individuals who retired, or they say they don't want a job right now. It could be individuals who aren't looking for a job, but it could be, and this is where I think some of it blends in with the global health pandemic, is people who say they want a job, who are looking for a job, but can't accept a job if they're offered. And that could be because of healthcare concerns. That could be because of childcare concerns. It could be because they just don't believe that job is out there for them in terms of what they need. So they can't accept the jobs that are being offered to them because they need maybe remote work as opposed to in-person work. And so if you look at that, we have around 24,000 open jobs. We have 8,000 people who are actively looking for work saying, yes, I will start tomorrow, basically. And then we have another 23,000 that have fallen out of the labor force that we don't know really how close they are to returning to the labor force, if at all.
That's a significant number, especially as we continue to experience this tight labor market and, employers are looking for more workers. Just 2 quick points here. I see that Kevin Chu with the Vermont Futures Project has added that data in there about the jobs that require less than a 4-year degree. So I encourage people to look at that. And then Matt, you talked a little bit about your passion for mature workers and what employers can do to attract them and retain them. And as you have a noontime presentation, so do I. I'll be talking to the Older Vermonter Caucus in the legislature about that very topic, about how important the mature worker is to filling current jobs and the need that we have and what we can do about that. So Matt, as always, thank you. Your presentation has been insightful. I always love the way that you're able to add a little bit of humor and current information. I love the fact that you encourage us to sort of power through your data, but I do often call this event of ours a little bit of a nerd fest. So we love the data, so thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. And for all of you, we had a great time here the last 2 days with the Economic Conference. It's something that has a passion that I have with the Vermont Chamber of Commerce to make sure that we provide really good data and information. This year, we were able to put the DEI lens on economic data and how we grow as Vermont in that way. We will be having post-event communications for you with links to presentations and recordings and all sorts of information, and continue the conversation in Q&A. We had 400 people register for the conference, so that's a great thing. I hope I get to see all 400 of you next January in person, maybe. The way things are going, who knows? I won't make a promise today, but that would be something that we can hope for. Thank you so much for staying with us, and have a good day.